Also welcome for me. I always have to say good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And this is of course something we take for granted, but it's always great to have a webinar where people from all over the world can actually listen in. The webinar will be broadcast from two places. Michiel and myself are in the Netherlands, and a new one is based in Sri Lanka. So it's a very international audience. In this webinar, we're going to talk about how the WSO2 API Manager helps to open up the Qby smart thermostat and energy monitor to developers. The largest part of the whole presentation will be spent on what the Qby smart thermostat is and the energy monitor and why it's such a great product that will help you save energy, and the need to open it up to developers when developers actually develop stuff for you, they're basically doing your work. So we have three people presenting, and I would like to ask Michiel to quickly introduce himself. Michiel, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Michiel Fokker. I'm IT architect at Quby. I'm responsible for the overall architecture, and when I joined 1.5 years ago the company, I found a closed ecosystem, and since then we're trying to open that up and to leverage on the platform that we're creating. I will be talking about that a lot more later on in the presentation, and we're doing that with the API Manager of WSO2. So, well, I'm excited to tell about that later on.
Okay, Nuwan, can you tell a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Hi, I'm Nuwan Das. I'm a technical lead at WSO2, and I'm also the product lead of the WSO2 API Manager. So basically, I'm responsible for the overall research, development, and also the architectural aspects of the WSO2 API Manager product.
Okay, great, thank you. Yep, I'm Rob Laboer. I'm a senior consultant at Yenlo. At Yenlo, I do a number of things. I'm an integration consultant, but I'm also a trainer, and I do many of the trainings like the ESB, the API Manager, etc., etc. And apart from that, I'm also blogging and writing articles on the Internet of Things, and one of the things I wrote about was actually about Quby, so that's how we got in touch and we started talking. So let's go on a little bit and talk a little bit about Yenlo. We are a premier partner of WSO2, and we really focus on the integration of systems, and we believe that the products from WSO2 are great for doing that, whether you're talking about an ESB or an API Manager, a data service, a server. Yeah, they're all, the modularity and the way they work together is one of the great things. So as a premier partner, we do product support, we do development, we do quick starts, we do trainings and certifications, and a lot of other things, among others these webinars. So we always like to use symbols. So here you see some of the stuff that we do. I already talked about it, so let's not go into that much detail. The agenda for this webinar is basically going to be a little bit about the API Manager. Since the release of the new version, there have been many webinars about the features and functions, and if you haven't tried out the API Manager, that's something you actually should do and try it out, because it's easy to use and it will give you great benefits. After the small talk about the API Manager, then we'll get to the introduction to Tone, the Tone Smart Thermostat or Energy Meter. Tone is the brand name that they use, and Michiel will talk about that later on. And then we're going to talk about what they're going to do and how they're going to open it up to developers, how they're going to manage them, how they're going to implement it, and stuff like that. So quickly about the features of the API Manager. Basically, what you can do with the API Manager is you can create, publish, and manage APIs and the whole life cycle of it. As you can see from the screen, you can create and publish them, you can advertise them in a storefront, you can do versioning, managing, you can monetize them. That's very important, and perhaps Michiel will talk a little bit about that as well. The possibility to charge for the usage of API, as we see an increasing number of companies do, because if you have someone that will call your API 100,000 times a month, they're actually using your resource. So it might be very well that you would like to have some money for that use. Implement governance and security, of course, with OAuth2. Facilitate community engagement, very important when you talk about a storefront where people can actually discover and test your APIs. Try and build a community, and that's one of the points that I'm pretty sure that Michiel will talk about as well as provide extension points. So when you look at the API Manager, there are basically 4 components. I already mentioned the store, which is basically the point where the consumers, and with consumers we mean developers, people who consume an API, can find, explore, subscribe, and evaluate the APIs that you put in there. The publisher is basically the backend where you and your colleagues as API creators develop the stuff that other developers are going to use. And the other 2 components are the gateway, which takes care of the security, the throttling, and the SLAs, and the key management server that takes care of the OAuth2 tokens and stuff like that. And when you look at the product, then of course BAM, the Business Activity Monitor, is something that's often used because it will give you access and insight into many of the analytics and offer you monitoring. So the store is basically a collaborative web interface to self-sign up, to subscribe, to get access tokens, to invoke them, and to engage the API community. And it's basically modeled after the store idea that was made popular by Apple, but now is something which we see increasingly. So Google Play, Microsoft with their Windows have a store, etc., etc. And what you see there is very important. You have to make it look pretty. You have to make it that people can actually find your API. So you use tags and you try to create a community of people using your APIs and perhaps even commenting on the APIs, asking for improvements, asking for new functionality, etc., etc. So that's the store. Then we have the publisher, where you can create the APIs and the API documentation. You can publish them, you can advertise them, you can manage the API lifecycle, etc., etc., community feedback. We'll have some more slides on the publisher a little bit later. And then, of course, as I talked already, the gateway. It's based on another product, the WSO2 Enterprise Service Bus, and basically to manage all backend functionality. So security and throttling, you can actually set the number of API calls that can be done per minute by a developer. You can do the security validations, you can do caching at several levels, and you can, of course, process the statistical data. And the key manager, that's the part that handles security and access token. I'll talk a little bit about the key manager when I'm talking about what's new in the latest version. The statistics, sorry, statistical dashboards help you understand performance, how much it's used, derive trends and insights, and explore and discover usage patterns. We use BAM for that, and one of the things that I like about this version is actually that BAM is now even easier to integrate because it's done from the UI, from the user interface, rather than from the configuration files. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so monetizing APIs, the possibility is there to generate usage reports and generate bills for API consumers on usage. There are several possibilities for that, but I think it will go beyond the scope of this presentation to talk about that. This one we already saw. So API design is basically a three-step approach. Let's say we would like to design a new API, then you will go from design to implementation to management, and basically go through all of these steps. The API that you see on screen now, the weather API, is the standard API that comes with the product, and that you can easily deploy and test out yourself. So you don't need to do anything to test out the product. And you can see here the APIs, the gets, the posts, the puts, the deletes, the stuff, the RESTful stuff that you can do with the API. When you go to the next screen, you can see that you can define an endpoint, you can have a production endpoint, you can have a sandbox endpoint. And in the last screen, you can see what kind of transports there are, the availability of tiers. You can say this is the default version, response caching, gateway environments, etc., etc. So there's a lot to be told about that, but that would be a whole presentation on its own. So I'll skip that for now. What's new in API Manager 1.9? Well, a lot of things have changed. The previous version was 1.8, and with to 1.9, there are no real major changes or things that have changed. But what is very cool is that we now have upgraded to Swagger 2.0, so that's supported. You can connect to a third-party key management and authentication system. That it used to be that you use the identity server for that, but you can now also point to another key manager if you would like that. You can import and export APIs from one gateway to the other. As I said, you can integrate BAM in an easier way, etc., etc. So there are a lot of things that actually are new and improved. And just before we go, or as the first question for the Q&A, I would like to ask Nuwan at the end of the presentation to talk a little bit about the roadmap, because what you see here now is the version 1.9, but WSO2 is already working on a new version, which will have, I'm sure, new features that we all would like. So basically, that's my part as far as introduction to the API Manager. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. We will see them and we'll make a list of them. And at the end of the presentation, we'll try and answer as many as we can. It's not always possible to answer all of them, but if you send me or the people from WSO2 a question, we'll follow up on that, and you will get your answer if you're not answered in the presentation, this webinar itself. So I would like to switch over to Michiel, who will talk a little bit about the Qubys smart thermostat and energy meter.
Okay, let's see how I can share the screen. Is everybody seeing the screen full screen right now?
Yes, I can see it.
Ah, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Rob, for the introduction. What I want to show you this evening is a little presentation about what Quby does and how our product looks like, and then elaborate a little bit on what we did with WSO2 API Manager to open up our ecosystem for external developers. So what is the product that Quby makes? Quby makes a smart thermostat and energy monitor for people in people's homes, where they can remote control their central heating boiler, and they can get insight in their electricity and gas usage. And Qby does not sell these devices directly to consumers. We do that over energy companies. So we have a contract with Eneco, one of the 3 largest energy companies in the Netherlands, and they brand our device as Toon, which is the Dutch name for Anthony, and they brand it as that Toon is your friend in your house, and Toon helps you to get insight in your energy usage and to preserve energy waste, and Toon helps you to increase your comfort level by being able to remotely control your central heating boiler. And we do that by having a little screen on the wall. That's the screen that you see currently in the presentation. And that screen acts as the gateway to the other components which we do support. So if you look at how the ecosystem in your house looks when you have a smart thermostat in your home, is that the device acts as a smart hub and integrates with, first of all, your central heating boiler, so the device on the top left, and we integrate with smart meters, electricity meters and gas meters, with analog meters. So if you don't have a smart meter yet, we can measure the electricity usage with an analog sensor, which consists of a little LED and light-sensitive diode, and we measure the relevations of the disk that you see on the electricity meter. We also support solar panel production, and we integrate with several smart home features like the Philips smart LED lights with smart plugs that are connecting over domotica wireless protocol called Z-Wave, and we are about to introduce integration with a wireless connected smoke detector. So you can use the little screen in your living room to control all this stuff, but we also have, of course, a mobile app, and we'll have a tablet app where you can see more details, where you can more easily browse through all the details of the data that is being collected by our device. So this is the main screen of the tablet app, and if you see here, then you'll see that you can have a graph. You can swipe through the graph. You can see what your energy usage in total was, and you can see, and that's the little purple blobs on the right bottom. That's the usage of one of the smart plugs that's also consuming some energy. So why did we want to open up the this ecosystem to external developers? First of all, we want to give them access because the mobile applications that we are using, the mobile phone app and the tablet app, they are already using an API, and we've been seeing that people want to use them, and they have been integrating with our current API, which is not controlled and not secure. So if you look at the architecture that we currently have in place for that, then you see on the top left the energy displays that connect over your Wi-Fi connection in your home to the internet, and they connect to our central cloud platform over a VPN connection that's being set up when the display is started up. And if you want to connect with your mobile device to that device, then what you do is you connect via the internet, of course, to a component which we call the mobile backend, which is basically a smart reverse proxy that over the VPN concentrator is directly connecting the display in your home over the VPN connection. And to ensure that that is being done safely, the mobile backend has integration with the self-care authentication of the energy company, in this case Eneco, and you'll supply your self-care credentials in the app, and then we look up in the asset management system which device is connected to which customer, and then we can connect you over the right VPN tunnel towards your own display. And this current architecture has a couple of disadvantages, and one of them is that it's unmanaged. So what we do is we see people coming in, but we cannot control which app they are going to use. Most of them are using the native app that we supply from the Apple iTunes Store and from the Google Play Store, but there is no barrier to reverse engineer the API and to just write your own application and connect to it. The second disadvantage is that we use a proprietary login system. So one of the calls that you do over the API is a login call, and you supply a username and a password. And if you don't want to re-enter every time that you start up the app, you don't want to re-enter that, and you will be storing this information on the mobile device. And of course, that is a security risk, because if your device gets stolen, potentially you could also access the self-care environment at the energy company. So these are some disadvantages, and on top of that, it's an undocumented and unsupported API, so that people that are trying to connect to our system will have a barrier there, and that will reflect in not so good quality of the software that they write, and that will negatively impact the reputation that our brand has in the market. So if you look on the internet, you will see that there are a couple of initiatives to connect other devices and other applications than the ones that we provide to our system. So if you look on the left screenshot, you see that this is a page from the Windows Phone app market, and there is a Thermostat app for Windows Mobile, but that is not supplied by us. We only support Android and Apple, and somebody reverse engineered the API and wrote his own application and put it in the store. And if you look at the right, you see on GitHub there is a Python library that does basically the same. So we'll see that there is definitely a need to open up the API. It's being done right now. We don't have any control over it, and we don't make the life of developers any easier by not supplying any documentation by it. So when we are discussing on how we could improve this situation, we had a few business objectives that we want to accomplish by opening up this interface. So first of all, we want to stimulate innovation by offering open and documented APIs so that we get external developers, maybe developing for a niche market. We had representatives over in our company from one of the blind support groups in the Netherlands, and they would like to have voice control for the thermostat. For us, this user group is too small to really spend as a little company. We're about 80 people currently to spend a lot of resources on that, but if we would have an open API, it would be really simple to just leave that up to an interesting party to write something themselves. So the second part is that we really want to leverage the power of an ecosystem. So if you open up your environment and you let third parties develop application for it, then the value of your platform will increase with the number of third parties that connect to your platform. So that we want to do as well. And there are some more technical objectives to have more control on who's accessing the interface, to be able to also have communication with the developer. So if there's something happening that will negatively affect the quality of our service, we can contact the developer and we can agree on a better way of accessing our platform. And we want to enhance security by not using the proprietary login anymore. And if you then look at the solution selection criteria that I used to select a product or to decide that we need to do our own development, then one of the things that was really important is that we didn't need too much development time to have a solution ready. So I was looking for an off-the-shelf product, and I wanted to support open industry standards for authentication, and I selected OAuth2 for that. We wanted to have a solution that would have developer self-care built in. We want to have an extendable solution because we are Quby as a company. We have the ambition to go abroad with this solution and to have several international customers, and we want not to have a point solution there. One of the very nice to have would be that we would have an open source solution. Our current platform is fully based on open source software. We have very good experience with using that, and we would like to have this extension to be also in open source. And we are a small company. We don't have really big IT budget, so it should be a solution that will fit in our budget as well. And as a nice to have, if we could have integrated documentation as well, then that would be nice as well. So when I was going over selecting candidates, then two of those candidates, they stood out, and one of them was MuleSoft and the other one was WSO2. And I'm not going to make a very detailed comparison between the two products, but two of the pros that I thought that WSO2 had over MuleSoft was that WSO2 is full open source. The full solution is available as source code, while MuleSoft has a community edition, but as soon as you want to do more advanced features, then you would use the enterprise solution, which is not fully open source anymore. And the other thing that I really liked from WSO2 is that they have a real clear pricing model for support and also for development. It's really easy to understand, and it's really clear what value you get for the money that you pay. So these were the main reasons, apart from, of course, the fact that both of the solutions would support all the requirements that we listed. So when I had selected WSO2 API Manager as the product that we want to use to open up the API, then this caused a little change in the architecture, and you can see, if you can remember the overview that I gave a couple of slides ago, that if you look at the difference, then the only difference is that between the mobile devices connecting over the internet to our data center and the mobile backend, we put the WSO2 API Manager, or basically the API gateway component of the API Manager. We put that in front, and we offloaded the authentication with the backend system from Eneco. We offloaded that to the identity server part in that product, and therefore from the mobile devices on, you would have a standard OR2 flow, and we deal with the backend integration with the energy supplier. For that to work, we needed a couple of small customizations. And the most important one is that we had to implement a custom authenticator plugin to interface with this proprietary web service that we use at Eneco to authenticate self-care users of the system. And what this web service does is it receives a username and a password of a customer, and it returns a client identifier. And this client identifier is necessary to look up the connection between the connecting customer and the actual smart thermostat that we have. And because we uploaded this authentication to the WSO2 component, we needed to have a mechanism to pass this information from the API Manager to this mobile backend. And we use a JSON Web Token for that, and we had to add an additional claim that contained this customer identifier. So what were our experience when we started to implement it? Is first of all that we found the software was quite stable and really easy to deploy. It's basically not more than downloading a big zip file from WSO2 website and unzip the zip file and basically use the startup script, either the .bat file if you're on Windows or the shell script, and then you have basically the standard up and running. And what we also experienced that, for me, this was the first time that I worked with WSO2 products, that is that I found the bundling of components a little bit confusing at first, because in the API Manager you will have several other components which appear in WSO2 products as well. So basically there is a skimmed down version of the ESB products of WSO2 in the API gateway, and there are several functions of the ESB that you could use by just installing the API gateway, and there is also a part of the identity server there, and it took me some time to figure out whether we could use the internal components for that or whether we use the external full product. And I'll come back to that later on when I will explain how we moved from the setup that we did for a first pilot and the production setup that we are currently preparing to go actually into production with. Further on, what we experience is that there is ample documentation available on the website of WSO2, but if you really want to customize the product, and we had to do that with the implementation of the custom authenticator, that it's really hard to just look in the source code and use the documentation, and we solved that by taking a development support package from WSO2, and after that we could liaise with the developers of the product itself, and then it greatly accelerated. And we first tried to do it without WSO2 support, and one of the lessons learned in this project, in this pilot, was that next time I will involve WSO2 support from the start, because it really accelerates your development. One last little takeaway is that we used for a pilot, which I'm going to show you the results of in a couple of slides. We used only the API Manager product, and while that product is quite complete, it lacks one small component that was actually mandatory for us, and that is a portal where, as an end user, you could log into and you can withdraw your consent that you have given for a particular third-party application because you lost your mobile or you're not interested and you uninstalled the app from your mobile phone. And basically that's not included in the API Manager, but that is included in the Identity Server product. So that's one of the reasons why we've chosen for the production version of the API Manager to deploy the API Manager and the Identity Server as two separate products. But first, I want to show you some of the results that we did for the pilot implementation. So this is a screen which is familiar. Rob showed a similar screen as well during the introduction of the product. So this is basically a vanilla installation of the store component. The only thing that we changed was we changed the logo in the left top, and it's a bit ugly as well, I have to admit. But and we published the API for our smart thermostat. And from a developer point of view, how would that look? So if you you go further on, you'll see that you'll have a couple of tabs if you go in there, and one of them is the documentation tab. So we were able to integrate the documentation into the portal and make it available for developers right away, and so we see that as quite a plus. So then one last screenshot. This is the login screen that you get redirected to when you're trying to access an API and you're not properly authorized. And this is also the screen that you would like to integrate into a mobile application in a HTML widget to ensure that authentication happens on the API management component and not in the app itself. So the app will never see the username and the password, and it will only receive the access token to access the API, and this dramatically improves the security. So what we did with this pilot implementation, we organized a hackathon with about 70 participants in March this year, and we tried out how this would work out in practice. And what's the result of this hackathon was that there was, I already told you, about 60+ participants, and after one weekend of hacking, we had 14 working applications, which is quite some achievement, because as a company with 80 employees, we would never be able to get that in one weekend. So just to show you a little bit what you can achieve in a weekend like that is that we had a completely native Windows mobile phone app, and that was not only a mobile phone app. If you install it on a tablet, you also had a tablet screen. and that was being made with a partner from Eneco in only 1 weekend with a couple of persons. And another team, they made a prototype of an application which you can install on your Apple Watch. And unfortunately, I only have a screenshot of an emulator because at that moment in time, the Apple Watch was not even released yet. So we had support of our smart thermostat before even the product was released. And one last illustration. This is a photo of the winners, and the winners, they had made an application. They were students, and they were living in a student home, and they made an application where you could share energy consumption over a couple of inhabitants in one house, and every participant in the house would have a smart plug, and you would add up each energy use of each smart plug, and then you could share the bill, and you could see an overview of all the invoices, and you could pay from the app even. And that was also made in 1 weekend, and then you can see that if you open up a closed environment and let other people get in, that they approach your product from a completely other angle that you would do it, and we would never have had come up with an idea like that. So that's really adding value to our proposition. So this was already March this year, and it was a big success. And where are we right now? Currently, we are performing next steps, and we are about to deploy a number of WSO2 products. Basically, the latest version of the API Manager, because in March we are still using 1.8, so we are going to migrate to 1.9. We are deploying a separate identity server component because of two main reasons. First of all, that is that the identity server has built in a kind of an end user portal where they can see which applications they have provided access to the API, and of course an end user will never perceive that as an API, so which applications have access to your smart thermostat. You can retract that consent. And the second reason why we wanted to have a separate identity server in the setup was that the identity server is fully supporting multi-tenancy, and I already explained that we are expanding our market into outside the Netherlands, and with the identity server we can very easily use one consolidated multi-tenant platform to open up the APIs for several energy companies. One of the business drivers of deploying an API management system was to get more control over the use of our API, and you can only do that if you can measure the usage, and you can consolidate those measurements, and you can report on it. And what we currently have is a very basic implementation of yet another WSO2 product, the Business Activity Monitor, referred to Rob as BAM, and we're using that to get an overview of which developers are actively developing applications that actively use our API, how many API calls are being made there, and currently we don't do any throttling there yet, but we just want to know what's happening to be able to learn from that, and to be able to if necessary, to provide to set the throttling in the API Manager. So that's the technical part of the next steps, and the non-technical part is that we are preparing ourselves for starting a real developer community, and to be able to manage that, and to engage actively in to get active developers. So these are, and then active community developers see that it actually works. We want our own mobile applications to start using that new API as well, and to move away from the proprietary API that we have currently. So this is basically the roadmap. And then as a last part, which is a little bit of a sidetrack from this presentation, is that when we have this in place, then nothing prevents you to start using the API Manager also for internal API usage. So then every service in your platform will be a first-class citizen, and every usage will be monitored and managed by the API Manager. So just to give you a little bit of additional information on what that means in terms of the architecture and the deployment, let's give you a little overview of what I just told. So if you look at the production setup, we use 3 products of WSO2. First of all, the API Manager, so with the components of the store, the publisher, and the gateway. And we use the second product, Identity Server, as a key manager, and to be able to integrate with the proprietary backend of Eneco for authenticating against the self-care platform that they have. And as a last component, we use the business activity monitoring to get usage reports out of that. So then a little bit of insight in what APIs we're going to develop there. It's basically the same functionality that we use to access the devices with our mobile phone app and our tablet app, and that's a status call where you can get status updates of what's happening in your house. There is the whole API for your central heating, so you can read out your day program and your week program. You can update temperature settings and you can update the program. You can read out the temperature. There is functionality in the device to record your energy usage, and you will be able to, over the API, to get data of your energy usage, your gas, your electricity usage, your gas usage, your solar production, and if you have smart plugs connected to your device, you can also read out historical usage data from that as well. So this is a little bit of one example of how this looks. If you look at the API on the left, you will see the URI that you're calling, and on the right you see a JSON formatted example of what the API is returning to your application. So one last slide before I hand back the presentation to Rob is an overview of how the actual deployment looks if you deploy the architecture I explained 3 slides before. So if you start at the top, you will see there is a load balancer to ensure that we can to ensure availability over multiple nodes. And what we did is we have an active-passive setup of the API gateway. That's mainly because of the support contract, which monetize on active nodes, and the volumes that we expect, they do not justify an active-active setup, so we've chosen there to have just active-passive. So we have one active gateway component and one passive, and if the active gateway component should die for some reason, then the passive node will take over. We will have a separate virtual machine where the store component is running, and which is also, of course, over the load balancer, reachable from the internet. This is where a developer will sign up for an API key and will be able to get a subscription on the API. And then we have a backend part where the publisher component is, that is only used internally to publish the API that opens up our smart thermostat to third-party developers, and that is connecting to the gateway to actually configure the gateway to access the right backend systems. So the gateway components, they will talk to the key manager, which are part of the identity server, and for high availability, these are also deployed on 2 nodes. One of them is active and one of them is passive. And all of these components will communicate with the shared database. We use a MariaDB cluster actually there. It's an active cluster with 3 nodes, and that ensures that whatever happens, the database is always available, because that's a prerequisite for the API platform to be available. Then if you look at the left bottom part, there you will see the connection from the gateway to the business activity monitor, where it will receive all the users events, and they will be stored in a Cassandra cluster, and the business activity monitoring reporting facilities can use that data to provide reports. So that's basically a little overview of what we did with API Manager to open up our smart thermostat platform, and what we're planning to do in the next coming of months. So thank you everybody for listening to me, and back to Rob now.
Okay, we can probably, if you go to the next slide, Michiel, we can probably stick with your screen, because what's left now is questions and answers. And what I would like to ask Nuwan is to talk a little bit about the roadmap for the new version of the API Manager. Nuwan, can you tell us a little bit about what your plans are?
Yeah, sure, Rob. So API Manager 1.9.0 was released in June, and actually at the moment we are working on a maintenance release of it called version 1.9.1, which is scheduled to be out by tomorrow. So that's a patch release basically, which doesn't have any features. It's a maintenance release. And then we are also working on another release of the API Manager, which version is API Manager 1.10.0. So that has a few features, basically mostly focusing towards enabling API monetization support on the product. And we are also developing a new RESTful API for the product. So as you might know, if you're a user of the WSO2 API Manager, we have a new set of APIs that can be used by external clients for various actions like creating APIs, publishing APIs, creating documentation, and also APIs that is used by the API store. So these kinds of APIs are pretty interesting to people who are developing their own store, and who are also interested in using various other clients to perform functions on the API Manager. So the set of APIs that we have today are quite limited, and it's not in a clearly RESTful way. So we are coming up with a new, totally new REST API for the product, which is actually in the design phase at the moment, and we will open it up for public discussion, and the design discussions are going on right now. So if you are interested, you could join the architecture mailing list of WSO2 and provide your thoughts on the API that we are designing. So that API is going to be available with API Manager 1.10.0. So that's about the REST API. Then we are focusing on a set of features to basically be able to support monetization on the product. So one particular improvement we are doing is an enhancements to the subscription workflow. So if you are familiar with the API Manager, you'll know that the API Manager has the capability of plugging in different workflows and different places, and one of that places is the API subscription, where at the time of subscribing you could plug in your own workflow to be executed. So one limitation with that particular workflow is that it doesn't really have the capabilities of redirecting you to a third-party system or third-party payment gateway or something like that. So we are enhancing that workflow part to be able to support that. And then we are also introducing a concept of paid versus non-paid or free APIs into the product. So we haven't still decided the architecture or design of it, but the overall idea is that the product is going to have a concept of paid versus free APIs, and the store is also going to absorb the capabilities where you will be able to list free APIs and list paid APIs likewise. And on the other hand, we are also doing some improvements to getting statistical or analytical details out of the product. So at the moment, what happens is the business activity monitor populates a set of data that can be used by various graphs and charts and other systems directly from the database. So what we're doing is we are coming up with a new API layer to access this particular data directly from, instead of accessing the data layer directly. So this API layer is supposed to give out the information that can be fed into billing systems or popular billing systems for generating bills and invoices. So this is basically a highlight, a very brief highlight of API Manager 1.10.0. It's going to have this set of features, and it's also going to be based on the new Carbon kernel version, which has been released a few months ago. Its version is Carbon 4.4.0. So the new product version is going to be on that. And we are also having plans for API Manager 2.0, which is probably going to be somewhere in Q1 or Q2 next year. So API Manager 2.0, the main highlight at the moment of that particular release is that it's going to be based on the enterprise store of WSO2. So we have a product called the enterprise store, which basically is a standard and a fully fledged store. And the API Manager is going to be built on top of that, which means that it will inherit some features of that particular product and have a lot of usability and UX improvements to it as well. There's also an idea of implementing the gateway over a new transport called NETI. So we are still in the research area of this. So basically, as you know, the gateway component of API Manager is based on the WSO2 ESB. So the WSO2 ESB is going to be revamped a little bit mainly for performance improvements. So as a part of that plan, there's an idea to use some other transports. So hopefully, if that goes well, the API Manager will also absorb the new gateway capabilities. So again, these features and functionalities for API Manager 2.0 are not really finalized yet, so we are still in the thought process of it. So yeah, so 1.10 and 2.0 are the two next releases to look out for during the next months to come.
Okay, great. Well, I think you have a lot of work that you need to do. It's almost 7 o'clock. We have time for one more question. This one is for Michiel. You talked a little bit about the enterprise service bus. Do you plan on using it in the setup, and what would you use it for?
Well, currently we don't have explicit demand adding an ESB component in the infrastructure. So I can imagine that when our platform will grow and when we would have a lot more additional services or a lot more additional energy companies selling our products in other countries and markets, that maybe there should be the need for having a separate component, but currently no. Currently we can do perfectly without it.
Okay, great. I think that's all we have time for. It's 1 minute to 7, and pretty sure people have things to do. So thank you, Nuwan, thank you, Michiel, and thank you all for listening to the webinar. If you have any questions that were not answered and we don't get back to you, please send me an email. You will find my email address on the Yenlo website, or send WSO2 an email, and I'm pretty sure they will forward it to me. So thank you very much. Have a great evening or a great day, and well, hope to talk to you soon. Bye bye.